Good afternoon. Sorry for the delay there. We had some technical issues. My name is Samir Jain, and I'm the Policy Director for the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT. CDT is a 25-year-old nonpartisan nonprofit organization based in Washington and Brussels. During those 25 years, our focus has remained on ensuring that technologies respect human rights and democratic values. One issue that has long been central to CDT's mission has been government surveillance and how best to balance legitimate security needs with the protection of human rights and freedom.
I can see.
Striking that balance was a challenge in the wake of the tragedy of 9/11, when everyone was understandably focused on taking steps to prevent such a horrific attack from happening again. One of CDT's founders and executive director at the time, Jerry Berman, testified before the subcommittee on the Constitution, Federalism, and Property Rights of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a subcommittee that was chaired at the time by Senator Feingold, who we'll hear from shortly. In the statement he submitted to the subcommittee, Berman warned, "We know from history, however, that measures hastily undertaken in times of peril, particularly measures that weaken controls on government exercise of coercive or intrusive powers, often infringe civil liberties without enhancing security." The day before the Patriot Act passed, he was more pointed, saying, as a Congressional Research Service report would later note, "This bill has been called a compromise, but the only thing compromised is our civil liberties." Of course, debate about the Patriot Act and the government's foreign intelligence surveillance authorities did not end with the Act's passage on October 26, 2001. Today, debate over US surveillance authorities is in focus with last year's decision by the European Court of Justice invalidating the key framework under which personal information of Europeans had been transferred to the US. The court's decision was based partly on the ground that, in its view, US surveillance authority under FISA is not limited to what is necessary and proportionate. So as we approach the 20th anniversary of the Patriot Act later this month, this seems like an auspicious time to take stock and re-examine government surveillance powers under US law. We are fortunate to be joined by an all-star group of speakers to do just that. We'll begin with a virtual fireside chat between Laura Murphy and former Senator Feingold, to be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Washington Post reporter Shane Harris, with three panelists who have spent much of their professional careers immersed in these issues. Let me briefly introduce our fireside chat participants. Laura Murphy has had a long and influential career as a civil liberties and civil rights leader, and CDT is fortunate that she serves on our board of directors. Perhaps most pertinently for our discussion, Laura served as the director of the ACLU Legislative Office here in DC for 17 years, a period that encompassed 9/11 and the Patriot Act's subsequent passage, so she was very much in the thick of the debate. Not content with her many contributions in her role at the ACLU, today Laura is president of Laura Murphy and Associates and is playing a leading role at the intersection of civil rights and technology, including by conducting a groundbreaking civil rights audit of some of Facebook's practices and advising Airbnb on its efforts against discrimination on its platform. Laura will be chatting today with former Senator Russ Feingold, who currently is president of the American Constitution Society. He served as US Senator from Wisconsin from 1993 to 2011 and was the only senator to vote against the initial enactment of the Patriot Act. A little more than 10 years later, Senator Feingold authored a book entitled While America Sleeps, a wake-up call for the post-9/11 era. In that book, he stood by his solitary no vote, counting that many members of the Senate have since admitted that they'd never read or even gained a basic understanding of what was in the Patriot Act, partly because there was so little time to review it. To pass this bill without considering even a single amendment to a document that exceeded 200 pages of criminal, intelligence, and military-related provisions when the bill had not been seriously reviewed by the Senate Judiciary Committee seemed tantamount to abandoning any semblance of a real legislative process. With that, let me turn the mic over to Laura.
Thank you, Samir. And Senator, it is so great to see you after all of these years.
Great to see you.
We've been through quite a lot together. But today we get to go down memory lane a little bit. And maybe we can start by you telling us where you were when the events of 9/11 happened. Tell us about that day.
Well, Laura, thank you. And when I look at you, one of the faces I most remember from those weeks, because you were key in our understanding the problems with the bill. And I want to thank you for that 20 years later. So where was I? I have an apartment directly across from the US Capitol. a couple hundred yards away, right across from the Supreme Court. My Senate office was across the street in the Hart Building. And, I was watching the Today Show, and just like everybody else, saw the first plane. And actually, I was doing an interview with Time Magazine, and all of a sudden I could see out of the corner of my eye that the second plane had hit. And so I said to my staff, come across the street into my apartment. And believe me, Laura, nobody ever got to come into that apartment because it was not in great shape. All of a sudden I had 50 staff members in there. And then about 15 minutes later, I noticed all these little kids running and kind of laughing across the Supreme Court grounds. And it turned out the police were telling them to get the heck out of there because they thought Flight 93 might be coming to the Capitol. And bang, bang, bang on my door in the apartment, David Corn of The Nation said, you guys got to get out of here immediately. And so we went 5 blocks down to another staff member's place and stayed there, for hours as we were trying to figure out what was going on. So we were right there thinking that we were still involved in the actual action that was going to occur.
Yeah, we just didn't know where that other plane was headed. So we were at a state of fear. And I remember there was a large donor meeting that the ACLU was hosting on P Street right off of DuPont Circle. And I was headed from my house there when the first plane crashed into the World Trade Center. And so, it was really jarring and scary, and people didn't know where to convene. And we were all on a high state of alarm. So let's go from that day and the whole idea that the Bush administration and Congress needed to react to this terrible tragedy and attack. What was going through your head leading up to the Patriot Act?
Well, in the hours afterward, we figured out we should go down to the Capitol Police, which was just a couple blocks away. And turns out there was kind of a rump Congress there. There were like 40 random members of Congress. I remember Joe Lieberman was there, some of the most conservative members of the House. And it was sort of like a General Haig moment, like maybe we should be in charge here. Of course, the leadership had been taken somewhere else. But, nobody really knew the scope of this thing at this point. And within 48 hours, we were in caucus. And I remember Senator Schumer, senator from New York, said they thought 20,000 people might have died. And our job immediately was to react to the administration's proposal for an incredibly sweeping authorization for the use of military force. And under the leadership of a number of the senior Democratic senators, it was cut back to what is still a problem, but an AUMF that is not nearly as bad as it would have been. It would be completely open-ended for anything they could label terrorism, anything in the world. So I actually felt that process went fairly well. I thought that President Bush's speech right after 9/11 was one of the best ones I've ever heard by a president. It was inclusive. It said, don't victimize Muslim Americans and South Asians. And so we also knew, Laura, as you did, that we thought there would be a bill fairly soon that would update various law enforcement authorities. And I assumed I would probably vote for that too, until at your urging, I read it. And people laugh when I say I actually read the bill. And with your help and the help of the ACLU and others, we were able to see that this was being used as an opportunity. As Robert Novak, the CNN conservative columnist, said at the time on Crossfire, this is an old wish list of the FBI that's been shoved into the Patriot Act because they knew it was going to pass. So that did not go as well as the first part of the process.
Well, we had an anti-terrorism bill that passed Congress a few years before. And I remembering the day of the attack, Greg Nojheim, who works at CDT, and I sat down with a yellow legal pad and wrote out all of the authorities that the FBI was trying to get in that previous bill, but were unable to get. And I remember that when we finally saw the Patriot Act, we predicted some of the authorities, but then the authorities went far beyond anything we could have imagined. And so, we scrambled to come up with talking points, analyses of all of these provisions and why they were a violation of civil liberties. And we we got some warnings from our colleagues in the movement, like, you guys, this may not be the time for you all to oppose the Patriot Act. And I said, this is the moment the ACLU and was made for, to stand up to excessive use of power or power grabs, violations of civil liberties. And so there was a bit of a fight among some of the people in the ACLU, but we were able to prevail. And then we were able to go public with you and tell you exactly what our concerns were. But I mean, this was happening like in maybe a 24, 48-hour time period. We weren't getting any sleep because the bill was so huge. And we were able to slow down the bill in the House. And they actually marked up a different bill. And at 3 a.m. in the morning, a new bill was substituted. And, you know, the one the administration wanted. So let's get to your no vote in the Senate. How did you develop the courage of your convictions? I mean, we all have courage. You've always had courage, but that was a special moment where there was an intense pressure on you. Tell us about your decision to vote against the Patriot Act.
Well, you know, it wasn't an example of intentional courageousness. It was an example of where it ended up looking like that. What I wanted to do was make sure there weren't provisions in there that had nothing to do with terrorism. And because of your work, we could see that this was things like the provisions having to do with sneak and peek searches and the library records and so on. This was a big power grab. And so, you know, I started raising questions, expecting that as a member of the Judiciary Committee, I'd have a chance to raise amendments in committee. You are right, in the House, on a bipartisan basis, people like Jim Sensenbrenner, conservative from Wisconsin, they were working to clean up the bill. But when it came to the Senate, we got shortchanged. Senator Leahy wasn't allowed to have a markup. And Senator Daschle wanted to go straight to the floor with this because they were afraid that the Republicans were going to use this as a way to get the majority. Well, of course, they ultimately did by doing the same scam with regard to the Iraq War. But that's what was going on. And I said, look, I'm not going to give unanimous consent to have this thing go forward unless I can offer some amendments. And frankly, Daschle was furious with me. I said, look, we have to get this right. There are things that should be removed or changed. And so all they did in the end to get me to remove my objection was allow me to offer 4 amendments the night of the vote on a limited time basis. But the interesting thing is, Laura, we had speeches by not only Democrats, but Republicans in support of my amendments. People like Arlen Specter, people like Fred Thompson and others said, you know, actually, he's got a point here. And obviously, Daschle came in and shut down the whole process and said, no, it's time to vote. We got to do it right now. And all of a sudden, as the vote was going, I was completely comfortable with my vote. I knew I had to do this. You know, for whatever reason, I was in the Senate at this moment in human history, basically, and I had to get it right. And I didn't realize until near the end of the roll call that I was the only one voting no.
Really?
I was the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee.
I remember.
So I thought maybe I ought to do my job.
Well, you did an amazing job. And I remember talking to you from the Senate floor to help you argue against some of the accusations made about your amendment. You did an amazing job. And I think you've gone down in history as a hero and as a huge defender of civil liberties. And do you have any last thoughts about what this did to you personally? Like, did it affect your friendships in the Senate? How did your constituents handle it at home? What is the political consequence of being a loner in this moment?
Well, I was very surprised because I really wasn't thinking about the consequences. You may not believe that, but it's true. What I do remember is on 9/11, I mean, a lot of times I did think about political consequences, but on 9/11, I thought to myself, well, I'm glad I went to law school because I remember a phrase: the Constitution is not a suicide pact. And you might think that was a reason to bend civil liberties, but that's not what the case where that Justice Goldberg's opinion in that case ended up being in favor of civil liberties, saying that our founders risked being caught and hanged every day and that they lived in terrible times too. And so were we because of this incident. And so I was amazed to go home and all of a sudden people were not just Democrats and liberals, but conservatives were saying, way to go. Thanks for asking some questions. And, to be honest with you, it was a very positive thing for me politically because conservatives thought I had an open mind about their feelings about civil liberties. A lot of it had to do with guns. I give you that. And the thing I like to say, Laura, it's funny, but for many years when I give a speech, I'd be introduced. And in the introduction, it would mention that I had voted against the Patriot Act, the only senator to vote against the Patriot Act, and I'd get a standing ovation. And I wouldn't get a standing ovation at the end of my remarks. It wasn't that good of a speech. It was just that vote. So, truth be told, it didn't hurt me politically, but I really had no way of knowing that at the time.
Well, it's interesting. I had members of my family say, you could be really ruining your career. And, I didn't pay them much mind because I just felt in my heart we were doing what was right. And the most satisfying thing about the campaign that the ACLU waged after the Patriot Act passed was all of these local jurisdictions, some totally conservative jurisdictions, passing resolutions saying the Patriot Act must be amended. The Patriot Act is an affront to civil liberties. And we had organizers stretched out all over the country who were working with these local jurisdictions to pass these resolutions. And those resolutions made a difference.
And you know who was helping you on that?
Huh?
You know who was helping you on that?
Who was that?
The librarians.
Yes, I remember the American Library Association.
Furious at the Section 215 library records. And it's a mistake to get all the librarians in the country mad at you at the same time. And they were very effective.
But can I tell you a little story? We did polling immediately after the act, and we asked people what excessive powers were they concerned about. And people had a real thing about the government snooping on what they were reading. And that was a revelation. And so when we shared that with the librarians, and they said, absolutely. And then they started to do their own polling and talking. And I mean, they were an outstanding partner in this effort. But I do think it took a long time. It wasn't until the USA Freedom Act, which I think passed in 2016, that we had the first substantive amendment to the Patriot Act. But I really believe that the revelations of Snowden led to that. And so now that we have a government that has these powers, you're at the American Constitution Society now. And what are you working on to help people understand why they need to control, surveillance, warrantless searches, those sorts of things?
Well, we're deeply concerned about government surveillance. We're deeply concerned about the unitary theory of the executive that allows the notion that the president or the executive can do whatever they want here. And we're also worried that in response to this terrible January 6th insurrection, one of the worst things in American history, that another mistake might be made, maybe from the other side. In other words, there may be legislation that would, to help get after those that did this terrible thing, that could be drafted in a sloppy way like the Patriot Act was, and it could victimize not necessarily people that did the insurrection, but Black Lives Matter people protesting the pipeline. And so once again, we as an organization, I wrote an op-ed that the Wall Street Journal printed saying, be on the lookout here. Let's not screw this up again. Let's make sure that what we do goes after those who have done wrong and get the information as appropriate about those who did wrong. But let's not have a sweeping thing that can be abused by law enforcement or by the executive in a way that will harm legitimate protests. So that's how we look at this today, in addition to, of course, wanting to continue to rein in the abuses and some of the provisions of the original Patriot Act.
Well, it's shocking to me how often legislation is written with a certain constituency in mind, and there's a lack of imagination about if this power was in the hand of someone who was opposed to your interests, how it could be used against you and the constituencies you serve. So, I mean, I just think one of the scary things about this moment that we're in is the polarization and the lack of empathy and conversation that goes on between these various constituencies. And the idea that you could be concerned about the rights of protesters from across the spectrum, whether they were at the Capitol on January 6th in a nonviolent capacity, or whether they were Black Lives Matter protesters, also nonviolent, that you could be concerned about both of them. It's just sad to me how few elected officials are talking that way right now. And even though the Patriot Act passed, and it was amended in 2015, not in 2016, by the way, even though it was amended, I mean, we still are not having the kinds of conversations about our liberties and how we need to protect them for everyone.
Well, that's right. And, one of the things that happened, even though I was the only one to vote against it, immediately after the vote, a number of senators from both parties came up to me and said, I'm not sure that this was a good idea. Let's work together to try to fix it. And, of course, it was people like Dick Durbin, but it also included Sununu from New Hampshire, Larry Craig. I think a couple of other Republican senators. We formed Lisa Murkowski. We formed a group of 6 or 7 senators working with you, and we were the ones that really started making progress on a bipartisan basis because they were getting, think of the states those people are from. These are very conservative places, New Hampshire less so, but live free or die. And what we had then was this ability to come up together that really doesn't happen now. Now they've drawn up sides. There's a little bit of it going on in terms of reining in presidential intervention, military intervention power. But in this area, it's still not where it should be. And that was one of the inspiring things about this. Alaska, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, those were the hotbeds of opposition to the Patriot Act. Maybe not always for the same reasons I would have been upset about it, but it did show that Americans could come together with very different ideologies to try to do the right thing in terms of protecting themselves from undue government interference or surveillance.
Beautifully said. And I just want to give you the chance to make any last reflections before I turn it over to Shane Harris. What's your overall feeling about the arc of the Patriot Act moment?
Well, it's a feeling of sadness that we had this moment of unity in the country that I thought President Bush and his administration, many members of Congress, were simply trying to get this right. And that was a moment where we put these things aside. But so soon, those who always exploit a catastrophe or a tragedy came in and said, hey, if we jam this thing through without changing it, if Democrats vote against it, we can punish them. Hey, if we make up some stories about what we need to do in Iraq, we can punish them electorally. So it was brutal opportunism. And that is what characterizes our politics today. Somehow, if we want a country we can all enjoy, we have got to get away from this slash and burn, winner take all politics. And this is an example of where doing more to fix this could begin to get us on that road.
Well, Senator Feingold, now that you're in DC more often, you're going to have to let me take you to lunch to some outdoor restaurant so that we can continue to reminisce a little more. I mean, there are many more stories that we can tell about people screaming and all of that, but we don't want to talk about those in public.
I would be delighted, and I look forward to it, Laura.
Thank you. I want to thank Center for Democracy and Technology for giving me the chance to talk to one of my heroes. I want to thank all of the great people at CDT, ACLU, the American Library Association, other organizations who came together in that moment to educate the public about how important our civil liberties are. So thank you. And I turn it over to Shane Harris. And Senator, you'll be hearing from me.
Thank you, Laura. I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Laura and Senator Feingold. What an interesting discussion. I think it brings all of us back to those moments in the very beginning of after the days after 9/11. That was when I started as a national security journalist and reporter. So it was a formative period for me as well. And this is a great opportunity to sit back and take stock of where we've come, both from the early days of the Patriot Act, which hearing the two of you talk about how it was just so quickly passed and so few people had read it, I vividly remember what was ultimately, it seemed like a lack of debate as this legislation was moving and the kind of palpable sense of urgency and fear that attached to it. But now we have an opportunity with our panel to really get into the meat of that law and kind of where we have come in that 20 years, where this sort of debate has deposited us. I'm pleased to bring on here, I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and we're going to have a discussion. Laura Donahue, who is the director of Georgetown University's Center on National Security. Chris Fonsone, who is the general counsel from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, and Sharon Bradford Franklin, who is the co-director of the CDT Security and Surveillance Project and the former executive director of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, another important organization to come out of in the period that we're all discussing here. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all in the audience. I'm going to moderate a discussion with our excellent panelists here for a while, and I want to try and reserve a good chunk of time at the end for your questions. So please use the Q&A function, ask your questions, memories, where we go from here, where are we in the moment, all of that's on the table. So please take advantage of our time together. I want to start just by noting that, while we're at the 20th anniversary of the Patriot Act, and that's principally kind of where we're focusing the discussion today, and certainly I think that law is the most well-known piece of legislation to be born of the 9/11 attacks, it's not the only significant change to surveillance law and to practice and to regulations. I would note that, of course, we have a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is much older than the Patriot Act, and it plays an instrumental role in the kind of surveillance that the government does, particularly with regards to counterterrorism and intelligence threats. People will remember that for many years after 9/11, there were secret interpretations of legal authorities that enabled things like the National Security Agency's Stellar Wind program, which we only learned about from press leaks in 2005, which of course was a program that involved warrantless surveillance of some Americans' communications. So there were fairly radical changes and reconsiderations to longstanding law that were going on for quite some time without the American people knowing about it. So we're not just talking about the Patriot Act when we kind of think about this universe of authorities and powers. So Chris, I want to come to you first to kind of set the stage for us as we begin the discussion here. Explain for us, what are the primary laws and authorities that the government uses to gather intelligence? Kind of give us the list of those so we all have a kind of common vocabulary here. And I wonder if you could also take a step back and look at the legal landscape that has evolved over these past 2 decades. And I'd be curious to know your high-level impressions about what the government, to include all the branches of government, has gotten right and where they've made mistakes in crafting authorities that meet the needs of national security while also respecting civil liberties, which of course is the balance we're trying to achieve here.
Well, thanks, Shane, for the question. Thanks, CDT, for having me, and thanks to their panelists for joining along. Those are obviously pretty big questions, so I'll try to be brief in answering them because I could go on for quite some time. I guess on the first question, authorities, the way I think about it, and I'm guessing Laura probably teaches a class where she spends several class sessions going through this, but I usually think of there being 2 categories of authorities that the executive relies on. They rely on statutory authorities and the president's constitutional authority to conduct intelligence activities. And just taking each of them in turn and sort of briefly summarizing kind of the key points to frame the discussion, sort of down the statutory branch, I think the main one you're going to be talking about in this space is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which you mentioned earlier, which is a creature of the 70s, sort of following on the Church Commission and the Pike Commission, investigating earlier abuses of intelligence authorities. And it's been amended a number of times, including by the Patriot Act in some ways. And FISA is really just a long, detailed statute that sets out a legal framework for how the government can seek approval to conduct certain types of intelligence collection activities. And that ranges from what people often refer to as things like traditional FISA or Title I FISAs that are essentially court orders allowing the government to conduct electronic surveillance that bear some resemblance to traditional criminal warrants you would see. And that ranges to, on the other end of probably the spectrum, in FISA, the Section 702 program, which is a more programmatic type of intelligence collection where the government conducts targeted surveillance of foreign persons located outside the United States, which has obviously been the subject of a lot of discussion since 9/11 or since it was enacted in the post 9/11 era. So all of this collection under FISA is overseen in some ways by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And that's really the main statutory branch of the authority structure of the executive branch. The other sort of branch of the authorities is the IC exercises some of the president's authorities as commander-in-chief and chief executive. And that's really done, the IC really executes those functions pursuant to directives from the president, executive orders that the president has issued in terms of how the intelligence community should be exercising those authorities. The most famous one that people talk about is Executive Order 12333, 12333, which kind of lays out and directs different intelligence community elements to engage in certain activities. And then I think the president and other executive branch officials have issued documents that cabin and put limits on the IC's exercise of these constitutional authorities. You have EO 12333 itself contains some of those documents, like the AG guidelines that are issued pursuant to 12333 also exercise that way. And then PPD 28, which is a more recent document also for signals intelligence activities, puts in place additional protections. So that's at a very sort of 20,000 foot level, 50,000 foot level probably, lay down of the authority structure by which the intelligence community conducts its activities. I think that the Patriot Act amended some of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act authorities, so that'll be part of our discussion. But I think a lot of discussions over the past 20 years have focused at different times on different elements of these authorities. Turning to your second question, which is again a big question in some ways, is the focus of this entire debate or this entire discussion we're having. I mean, just a couple quick thoughts, as you told me you might ask this before the panel. Just two things that I think we might have gotten right and two things we might have gotten wrong. The first thing, and I know this doesn't end the debate, and sort of in some ways just starts it, but as someone who was living in New York City at the time of 9/11, it certainly wasn't obvious in the immediate aftermath of the attacks that we'd go 20 years without a similar type of attack. And I think that's, to someone who's working in the intelligence community and in the national security world, seems like something we got right and something that was a success. And, which leads obviously to the second question, which I think is a lot more complicated, which is, did we go too far in the immediate aftermath of the attacks? And that's here, I think the first thing I'd find that we got wrong is that, we overshot. And I think this is something the government often does. And I think this was the function of the first panel, that, there are a number of things that since, as 9/11 has gone further into the distance, we've reconsidered. We've pulled back some of the Patriot Act authorities and things like the USA Freedom Act. Some things that were done under constitutional authority are now done under statutory authority. I don't think this is that unusual, and we might talk about this throughout the panel about how after major national security events, the beginning of the Civil War, start of World War II, the start of the nuclear age, the U.S. government takes a lot of actions that I think, as those events go further and further into the distance, we pull back on. So I think that's something we should definitely keep in mind as we seem to be entering a new phase of sort of national security interest, where the 9/11 era is, obviously still something we have to concern ourselves with, but we're talking about and thinking about new things like technology and great power competition, and just remembering that when we make those pivots, we often make mistakes, which I think leads to the second thing I'd say we got right, which is, I think this process of being willing to correct ourselves and being willing to have a constant conversation and constantly consider the types of authorities we have is something that I think is one of the benefits of our system, and one of the things that the system has gotten right. Now, we're going to have this whole discussion, and people are going to disagree on whether we've established the right equilibrium, whether we have the right set of authorities in place now. But I think the fact that in the 20 years since 9/11, we've been having this debate and having this discussion, and we have pulled back on certain authorities and we have changed certain things, is something we've gotten right, and that it's been a good thing. And that leads to the final thing, which is the second thing I'd say we got wrong. We overshot initially. I think the second thing we got wrong is that I think the government can do a better job, and has at certain times and hasn't at certain times, facilitating this process of considering whether we have the right authorities in place. And I think the key element there is transparency. I mean, sitting in my seat, it's hard sometimes to talk about the authorities the IC is exercising, because just talking about them often discloses what you're doing, which is obviously defeats the purpose of engaging the activities. But I think there's ways, in the way I kind of think about it is, whenever we're making we should really try to make the broad contours of what we're doing to the public, and make to the extent, maximum extent possible, the legal interpretations we're doing of our underlying authorities public, because that lets the public think about what they're doing in their name and allow us to course correct if we can. I think the times when we've gone in the biggest trouble and when we've found that we were most dislocated from what the public wanted were times when, like for instance, with the Section 215 program, where we may have been able to say something a little bit more public before we did, and the fact that it came out in the way it did, I think, led to part of the problem. So that's some just initial thoughts on both the authority structure and kind of what we did right and what we did wrong. But obviously, I'm guessing Sharon and Laura and you will disagree with a lot I've said, and that's, I think, why we're here.
Great. Well, that actually tees up really well for the question I want to turn to Sharon for. Chris is describing what the kind of the climate and the atmosphere of the debate was, particularly when the Patriot Act was passed. And importantly, for everyone to remember is this sense that another attack could have happened at any moment. And this is something to always be keeping in mind, because it's sort of a driving force behind legislation and behind what policymakers are doing, sometimes out of the public eye. Sharon, I'd like to know from you, because CDT has been at the table, either at the table or influencing the debate on the entire sort of surveillance architecture, even before the 9/11 attacks, clearly. So has the debate shifted? I mean, where are we from sort of where we were then and the kind of things that we debated broadly to what we talk about now? I mean, that can encapsulate a lot, even our changing notions of privacy. But to you, from the big picture, how is the way we debate these issues and talk about them changed? And how has that shifted during these past 2 decades?
Thanks, Shane. I guess I would say that for CDT, my predecessors at CDT and other advocates, in many ways, there has been a consistent thread in our advocacy since 2001, which is we definitely want the government to keep us safe, but we need robust guardrails for government surveillance. And there are a number of elements of what those guardrails should involve that have longstanding roots in our legal system. So things like requiring the government to make a factual showing that the particular targets of surveillance are tied to terrorism or other wrongdoing. In most instances, having judicial review and approval for targets. And of course, always having a robust oversight. And a problem with the Patriot Act was, in many ways, it removed guardrails that had been in place or failed to extend guardrails for some of the new authorities that were being created. So I would say back in 2001, and really for the next 18 years, much of the debate and concern focused on Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which Chris has already mentioned. And this is the business records provision. A version of it existed, of course, before the Patriot Act. But with the Patriot Act, it vastly expanded the government's power to obtain a wide variety of business records without a warrant. And it eliminated the requirement that the government had to show that the information sought pertained to a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. So really tying it to those actors who are wrongdoers. Now, the Section 215 was controversial initially as the library records provision, as we heard during the fireside chat. It subsequently gained even more infamy, of course, as the provision that the government turned to try and justify the bulk phone records program that was revealed to the public by Edward Snowden in 2013. However, in March of 2020, just as we were all going on pandemic lockdown, Section 215 actually expired along with 2 other surveillance authorities. Now, it's important to note that the government has been able to continue Section 215 investigations that it began under this authority prior to that expiration. And of course, the business records provision still exists in its pre-Patriot Act version. But I just want to talk a little bit further. Since Section 215, as it was passed in the Patriot Act and then subsequently amended to a certain extent thereafter, it isn't there right now. I just want to focus briefly on two other surveillance authorities that I think really do illustrate the way that these concerns have continued with the lack of guardrails. So one quickly is national security letters, or NSLs. And these are administrative subpoenas or demand letters that the FBI sends to obtain certain information. And they involve no judicial review at all. And similar to the case with Section 215, the Patriot Act removed the requirement that the government could only seek information that pertained to a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power. So that is a troubling change and makes this authority really have potential for abuse. The other authority I want to touch on briefly, is, at least right now, is Section 702. And this is an authority that had its origins in the Stellar Wind program that Shane mentioned at the outset, and started out as surveillance under claims of inherent executive authority under the secret authorization from President Bush. As I think was already mentioned, it was disclosed to the public, or at least one element, the element that became Section 702 was disclosed to the public in December of 2005 through a New York Times article. And there was a great deal of debate, and a lot of organizations, including CDT, argued how this was illegal. But ultimately, Congress codified a version of it as Section 702 of FISA. And a key feature, just to focus everyone on with the ongoing need for guardrails, is this involves warrantless collection of emails and phone records. Now, it authorizes the government to target non-Americans who are located outside the US, but if Americans are in conversation with those non-Americans, their communications can be collected as well. And not only are there no warrants, but there's no judicial review of the particular targets as well. The FISA court only reviews very broad outlines and rules under which the program is authorized. And the final quick point I just want to make before I turn it back to Shane is, with Section 702, once the government has collected information, the current rules allow it to then search through that data, looking for information about specific Americans, again, without a warrant or without any kind of court review. So I think these programs continue to illustrate the ongoing need for robust guardrails.
That's great. So the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act has come up already many times. I want to turn to Laura. You've had the rare experience of not only going inside this secretive surveillance court, which I think most Americans probably knew very little about before 9/11, and maybe even before the New York Times revelations that Sharon alluded to from 2005. But you've actually made legal arguments in front of judges on these highly technical, consequential laws and authorities. So tell us about your role as an amici for the court. What do you do, and why was that reform important in the history that we're talking about today?
So, what's also come up in the discussion is basically the role that Snowden played. And I think that it can't really be overemphasized because it's been just so profound. Before Snowden dropped the documents and leaked all of those documents in June of 2013, there were only 6 cases from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in the public domain that had been redacted and declassified. Now there are almost 100 cases in the public domain that have been declassified. Orders, the orders that are issued by the court, there was 1 in existence before Snowden. There are now almost 300 orders in the public domain that have been declassified, redacted, and formally declassified. There are many more that haven't been redacted that Snowden leaked. But in terms of formal declassification, and when that happened, when he started showing how Section 215 was being used, so there was a clause that said that you had to have reasonable grounds to believe that the information to be obtained was relevant to an authorized investigation. That was being interpreted secretly as all telephony metadata is potentially relevant to potential investigations. Therefore, we're going to collect all Americans' telephony metadata. And that was just such a gross misreading of both congressional intent as well as the statutory language. In fact, a number of courts have since, most recently the Ninth Circuit in 2020, found that language to be illegal. It was contrary to the statutory intent. That when that language came out and what was being done under 215, as well as the concerns that Sharon raised, all three branches had to respond. So suddenly the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, went from being like this unknown entity to suddenly having money and starting to get its act together and issue reports on this. President Obama put together a review board. He then issued PPD 28. So the executive branch had to respond to the Snowden documents. The courts went into high gear. So the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court had never had a public filing, never, zero, since 1978. Suddenly there were 160 within a year. 160 public filings before the 5th, so much so that even by the end of 2019, 60% of the court's docket had come from the Snowden documents, just that particular year. And there were numerous cases that went through the ordinary geographic courts, the non-specialized Article 3 courts that were challenging it. So we had ACLU versus Clapper, we had Clayman versus NSA. We had courts coming out and saying this was unconstitutional and it was illegal what had happened. And numerous criminal defendants began challenging it when they realized that their information was derived from FISA. We also had multiple FOIA suits, and kind of something that's run under the radar has been the extent to which FOIA has been an incredibly effective tool to get more information about what's going on inside the government. Tens of thousands of pages of information have now been disclosed about these programs that were hitherto secret. Well, Congress was really no exception. So from 3 bills, the year prior to the Snowden documents dropping, there had been 3 bills proposed in Congress. And that was a year when there were 3 expiring provisions, the roving wiretaps and, and the Section 215, they were actually in the lone wolf provision were going to expire. There had been 3 bills proposed. The year following Snowden, from June 13th of 2013 until June 11th of the next year, there were 42 bills proposed, which had radical changes proposed in them. Everything from demolishing, dismantling the court, to increasing the size of the court, to changing how the judges were appointed. There had been a lot of concern that they had been appointed in a partisan manner. There was just a radical kind of range of proposals. Now, amongst those, the one that gained traction and actually passed is called the USA Freedom Act. And the USA Freedom Act is basically the statute or the vehicle through which Congress then began to say, first of all, there will be no bulk collection under Section 215 or pen register trap and trace or the national security letters that Sharon mentioned. So that statute actually changed what was allowed because of what the government had been doing. It also amended its Section 215 to allow for limited collection of call detail records. It required the Attorney General to submit any FISC or FISCR decision. So FISC and FISCR are how we refer to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court of Review, where appeal is to from the FISC. And so any FISC or FISCR decision or order that has a significant interpretation now has to be reported to Congress. It also directed the administrative office of the U.S. courts to make annual reports on things like the appointment of amici. It required the DNI to start releasing data related to Section 702. And we haven't discussed 703 or 704, but those were new provisions added to extend new protections to U.S. citizens based overseas, where before collection was under what Chris really adroitly laid out, the kind of the intelligence infrastructure. It was under 12333. Starting in 2008 with the FISA Amendments Act, it changed so that if it was a US person being targeted and they're reasonably believed to be overseas, depending on where the collection takes place in the US or overseas, then it falls within 703 and 704. And now we actually have to have those numbers reported. So on the amici front, what that legislation did was it said that the court had to appoint at least 5 people as amici curiae to make legal arguments in front of the court. They were to select individuals, the statute reads, who possess expertise in privacy and civil liberties, intelligence collection, communications technology, or any other area that may lend legal or technical expertise to the court. And basically the amici's duty is the best job description in the world. If you're going to go to school for 25 years, like it really doesn't get any better. I'm a con law professor, right? I teach national security law, and the job description is to make legal arguments that advance the protection of individual privacy and civil liberties, information related to intel collection or communications technology, or legal arguments or information relating to any other area relevant to issues presented to the court. So it's kind of this amazing opportunity to bring legal arguments. From 1978, until the USA Freedom Act, there was no adversarial party before the court. So basically the government would go in, request surveillance, and then the court typically granted it. They only refused it a handful of times before 9/11. And even after that, there wasn't a very high denial rate. And so what this did was it really shifted the landscape to allow the court to hear from adversarial parties. Now, the legal advisors to the court have historically performed that function. You know, their loyalty is to the court and they're there to provide other legal opinions, but this just provided another source. And we know from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts, there have been reported that since the USA Freedom Act passed, there have been 16 times that they have appointed, at least 16, since it's now a little bit of time since the last reporting, at least 16 amici. Well, so there are 5 amici at any one point in time, plus there are technical amici who've been appointed. And overall, as a total, on 16 different cases, they had amici step forward to actually make these legal arguments. The one thing I do want to add, and then I'll stop so we can really get into a back and forth, and I hope we do, is that, you know, looking at the performance. So one of the things to point out with the legal opinions that are now in the public domain. So I actually put together a website for this because all the FOIA documents are scattered all over the internet. It's hard to find these redacted, declassified opinions because they redact docket numbers, they redact dates, they redact the judges' names. So there is no catalog, you know, Dewey Decimal System, Westlaw system, right, for these documents. So I put together a foreign intelligence law website through our library. I worked with our librarians who are also my heroes. Shane, it was nice to hear you mention sorry, it was Senator Feingold in the earlier session mentioning what Ashcroft called the hysterical librarians, how they kind of took to the road to defend themselves and defend the ability of individuals to read the library provisions, as Section 215 was called initially. Well, I worked with our librarians to put all this information in one place. And when you go through those roughly 100 opinions, there are now more FISA cases in ordinary Article 3 courts than there are at the FISC. There are hundreds in ordinary courts. And if you look at the 300 orders and all of the documents there, it becomes clear that what the court is really wrestling with are 5 things, right? Like first are just like the routine, usually Title I, Title III orders, setting hurricane aside for the moment, setting like whatever happened during the 2016 presidential elections to the side. There are just the routine matters of the court. But then there are these 4 areas where you see lengthy opinions coming out of the court. The first, and I think is the toughest one, is how to fit new technologies into old statutory language. And that consumes an enormous amount of time. And that's precisely where the rubber hits the road, I think, in regard to civil liberties and protection of privacy. Because on the one hand, you know, the government is in this role of trying to protect national security and keep the country safe from attacks. And they want to use the tools at their disposal to do that. On the other hand, these tools often work multiple ways, and increasingly we're seeing the mass collection of deep information on individuals, and that creates some immediate run-ins with First and Fourth Amendment concerns. The second question that comes before the court are really compliance issues and representations to the court that turn out not to be true. And unfortunately, this is deeply problematic, right? This actually, as we saw very recently with Michael Horowitz, the DOJ Inspector General, has issued 3 reports now looking at really kind of malfeasance in terms of the way in which these applications have been filed, whether or not they're actually supported with factual information. In one instance, the actual doctoring of an email to make it look like somebody was a foreign power, an agent of a foreign power, which is a term of art under FISA, and then submitting these applications to the court with errors in them so that the court is making probable cause determination based on faulty information and information that contradicts information held in FBI files, for instance. It's deeply problematic. So the compliance role is a new one for the court. That's not what it had been envisioned as performing. And what has happened is repeatedly, the court has, for instance, instructed the government to take certain actions, and it it hasn't done so. And the court will find out 3 years later, oh, wait, you're not using reasonable articulable suspicion to query it. That makes it a Fourth Amendment violation. And the government says, yes, we'll fix it. And 4 years later, they come back and they're still doing it, right? So this has actually taken up a lot of the court time, as you see from these opinions. The third of these other 4 areas would be the constitutional questions. And the court, from these published opinions, has spent less time on the First Amendment issues, but that's a big area. And I think increasingly so, especially as we're getting into more and more open source intelligence type of an environment with social media, and so on, that these First Amendment issues, I think, are really important issues. Every provision in FISA, all 15 provisions in the statute that deal with US persons have a First Amendment proviso that says it cannot be conducted surveillance solely on the grounds of First Amendment protected activities. And that's an area where we see some discussion in the FISC opinions. There are 4 of them on it, 2 of them that discuss it in great detail, but not a lot more than that. The Fourth and the Fifth Amendment have also gotten a lot of attention. The Fourth, obviously, much more than the Fifth Amendment, although one would expect even more discussion of Fourth Amendment in some of the cases, especially the early PRTT, pen register trap and trace cases. The fifth and, well, the fourth of these additional 4 areas where you see these opinions really weighing in is on the specialized nature of the court as an Article 3 tribunal. So it has all the FISC and the FISCR have all the powers of an ordinary court under Article 3. And what that means is when the government comes into court and says, we can classify your opinions and prevent anybody from seeing them, there are serious separation of powers issues that really ensue from that. And their specialized nature also goes to what potential avenues are open to them. What common law rights can they use? What kind of judicial censorship can they use? How do they understand their position as an Article 3 court, despite all the careful jurisdictional limits that are placed in the statute? So that's what we really have seen coming out of the court. I'd be happy to talk as we get into the discussion more on some of the concerns that I have.
Well, Chris, let me come back to you because I want to give you the chance to respond to some of these, critiques and the points that the other panelists have offered. And, I'll note again, Snowden keeps coming up, which is also to remind people that, Edward Snowden produced these documents, obviously through the press. The press has played a big role in illuminating many of these laws and their use. I want to give you the chance to respond to that too, because of course, people in the intelligence community will point out that there are instances in which these revelations, they will argue, have actually impeded the ability of the intelligence community to do the operations that they believe are allowed under law. So if you want to address that from kind of the operator's point of view, I think that would be valuable to discussion too.
Sure. Thanks, Shane. And thanks, Laura and Sharon, for your comments. I mean, I guess, Laura, maybe I'll talk about each of them in turn. Just Laura's is the one that are fresh in my mind, and I think she's done a very nice job. I think detailing how the FISC, how the government engages with the FISC, and obviously there are circumstances where the FISC has highlighted errors the government has made or compliance mistakes the government has made. In some ways, I think that is the system working as it's intended. And I think that there's this overarching struggle, which is there's activities the government, Congress has decided through passing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the executive branch has decided by employing the authorities offered by the executive, by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, activities the government thinks it needs to do to keep the country safe. But it's I think easy for folks in the executive branch to overweight one side of the balance. And the question is, since it's very hard to talk publicly about the specifics of these things, what sort of mediating institution do you set up to provide a sounding board or provide another check on the government's authorities? And I think the FISC, for a large portion of what we do, serves that role. I think a lot of the debate since 9/11, as we've talked about, and Laura walked through a lot of the changes, including the creation of the role she fills, is figuring out if we've calibrated that exactly the right way. And I think over time, we've probably thought, well, for a variety of reasons, which I'll get to in a second, I think we've thought we needed to change the equilibrium a little bit. We need to bring in alternate voices to talk to the government. And I think what you've seen happen, and I think this is the first of the 4 things that Laura talked about, and I think presents the trickiest thing, has presented the trickiest thing for the last 20 years, and it's the thing that in my job I worry about the most going forward, is it's not these issues aren't static. They're dynamic, and they're dynamic because the underlying technology changes quite a bit. And laws, you can't update the laws every time technology changes. Like when the Patriot Act was passed, I don't think I even had a flip phone yet. I probably still had one of those Nokias with like an open face that you would have to, or might still have been, it wasn't so long. It was like a couple of years after I would have to like call my voicemail late at night to see if I had to, go into work over the weekend. So that's just 20 years ago. And there's been, several generations of technology since then. So technology is changing much faster than the law can change. I think the executive branch is in this position where they want to use the authorities they've been given to keep the country safe. They want to try to do it in a way that's consistent with those authorities. And the fisc is put place in this role of trying to interpret statutes in light of changing technology. And I think that I'm not sure that we set up the exact perfect system to do this, but it's kind of a unique system worldwide. And it's, I think, a system that does in some ways show how we've been adaptable in the post 9/11 world, which I think is a positive thing. I mean, the fact that the government makes mistakes and there are compliance incidents, don't want to speak about any specific one. I think that's going to happen. Having worked at the White House, having worked in the private sector with private companies, and now working in the intelligence community, in some ways, the intelligence community is the most regulated entity of anywhere I've worked previously because of the heavy oversight of the FISC, the Congress, the public. There's just a lot of compliance architecture that's in place. It doesn't necessarily, I understand why that's the case. I mean, intelligence community does things that private companies can't do and takes actions that do need to be addressed from a civil liberties and privacy perspective, but doesn't mean that there's no compliance architecture in place. In some way, the FISC pointing out these compliant errors is obviously another good thing. So I guess that's sort of my thought in response to Laura, is that I think in some ways what she's saying is the system working, and the fact that this is now public much more, I think means that gives Congress and the American people the chance to also recalibrate, like we're continually seeing. And I think one final point, and this was mentioned, I believe, by Samir at the outset, is it's not just a U.S. debate anymore either. I think that things like the Schrems decision shows that data isn't just contained within the United States; it flows across borders, and other jurisdictions and entities have a role to play now well, at least they have a role to play within their jurisdiction in terms of whether or not they will allow data to flow to the United States. And that has an impact on how we think about things and has an impact on how we're regulated. So I think that all of these things suggest to me that there has been this continual conversation since the Patriot Act was enacted. It's a positive thing. We've moved in the direction that I think you would have anticipated at the time the Patriot Act was put in place, which is as 9/11 has gone into the distance, we've probably backed away from sort of the high water mark there, but it doesn't mean that we're necessarily in the right place today.
Chris, you said something too, that, this idea that technology moves faster than legislation, which is something I think is just true. It's also something I've been hearing for all of the 20 years that I've been covering these topics. And it used to be something that people said they almost bemoaned it, right? And to say, our processes are behind the technology. And sometimes, not saying you're making this argument, but it became sort of a way for people to default towards giving the government more authority, right? So go ahead and give them a wider lens because they've got to sort of outrun the speed of technology's evolution. I've just kind of come to believe that it's always going to be this way, that the dynamic of technological evolution in the marketplace is just designed to move faster than legislation, which it probably may be a good thing in some respect for that. But, let me bring this back then to Sharon. So if we're talking about we keep kind of coming into this area of we're trying to get this balance right, which I think is an appropriate thing to point out here, right, is that everyone who's involved in this is, I think, coming at it from a mostly good faith perspective of recognizing there is an inherent need for a balance. So maybe Sharon, talk a bit about, what changes we might need to make to get more to it. I mean, what about is there a need to expand and strengthen the role of amici, the role that Laura plays and others like her before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, for instance?
Absolutely, yes. So yeah, a number of changes and the things that we do need to have as we go forward. So I'll just start with a very specific question. There is definitely a need to expand and strengthen the role of the FISA court amici. And back before this role was created with the USA Freedom Act in 2015, I was serving as executive director with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and the board's report looking at the bulk phone records program also looked at the role of the FISA court and recommended at that time what the board unanimously, in a unanimous recommendation, bipartisan, all 5 members, a role they called special advocates, which was stronger than what Congress ultimately codified as the amicus. And I'll just highlight 3 particular ways in which those recommendations called for a stronger role, in which I think we definitely need to do that today. First is to expand the cases in which the amici appear. Right now, the role calls for their participation in cases involving significant legal issues, but that is too narrow. We've already been talking in the panel about where technology gets out ahead of the law, or where there are questions about how existing law applies to new technologies. There's also issues, Laura mentioned, First Amendment issues, coming up. So we need to expand those kinds of cases in which the amici appear. Second, the amici need to have full access to the information related to the matters in which they appear. The current law only requires that the judge can decide what what information they have access to. Anything that is in the relevant record should be or related to information that the government attorneys may be pointing to. The amici need to have full access. They already have full security clearances. And third, the amici should be able to petition for an appeal. There's been a lot of conversation I won't get into now about Article 3 and what the limits may be, but there are ways to do this consistent with constitutional requirements to enable situations. So not just the government can say this case needs to go up to the FISA Court of Review, but the amici can as well. And then in turn to take a FISA Court of Review opinion and petition the Supreme Court to hear that. More broadly, we need to have really a comprehensive look at our surveillance authorities. Chris was talking about how there is so much regulation and oversight by the FISA court, but it's important to recognize that what he was talking about initially, there's the whole set of surveillance activities, other intelligence activities that are done under the president's authority, generally under the rubric of Executive Order 12333. The FISA court plays no role whatsoever in overseeing any activities conducted under 12333. And so with all of these things that we've been talking about today, I think we need to have a comprehensive look at our surveillance law. The best we've done so far since 2001 was in the aftermath of the Snowden disclosures with the debate that led to the USA Freedom Act. That was the one time, as Laura Murphy was talking about, since then that we've had some kind of meaningful reform, but that didn't go far enough. And again, wasn't the full kind of comprehensive look that we need to have.
Great. Well, I want to come to Laura next too, and just I'm going to start threading in some of the questions from the audience now too. And Laura, there's actually one for you, which will dovetail with some of the things that we've been talking about. And just mindful of everyone's time, and we started a little bit late. I'd like to get to as many questions as possible, so let's try and keep our answers brief and substantive, but do a little bit of a lightning round here. Laura, the question for you from Jennifer Granick actually is, tell us a little bit more about the resources that FISC amici have to litigate these matters. And she asks, is it a David versus Goliath situation?
So hi, Jennifer. Is it a David and Goliath situation? There was a wonderful, one of the transcripts that has been released and redacted, declassified by the court, or by the government declassified, said that there was an instance where there was an amici sitting and like 17 or 18 government attorneys sitting across from her, right? And a government the size of ours with hundreds of attorneys in the intelligence community, thousands of people working on these issues. And we have 5 amici before the court. Like, you don't have to do rocket science to understand that there's a difference there, right? Now, the advantage, of course, is that sometimes when you have one person working on something, you can pull a lot of information together into one place, as opposed to when you have a whole team of people and you get contradictory, faulty, or just bad arguments, going on. So it's not necessarily always unsurmountable, but it is something to be thinking about. I do want to say something about this transparency. Like, transparency is all well and good. It is not the key issue here. And I think there was a question in the queue saying, like, what's going to be the Patriot Act of the future if we're going to look back? And here, I think I'm going to hold Chris's feet to the fire just a little bit on this one, although it's not entirely fair because you just came in, as GC. But I'd say actually fidelity to law judicial discretion and established processes is the problem right now. Like, this is what we're going to look back on, and people will, historians, I'm an historian, right? My PhD is in history. People are going to look back and kind of pick this apart. And let me give you some examples. So on law, I gave you that one already on section 215, like that the interpretation of reasonable grounds that something is relevant to an authorized investigation is, oh, all telephony metadata is potentially relevant, right? That it doesn't pass the laugh test. This is not chalk on the cleats. This is like pass the cheerleaders out of the stadium, right? This is so far removed from the statutory interpretation, but there have been many others. Under 702, you can't knowingly collect entirely domestic communications. Well, in October of 2011, the court discovered for the first time that the government was knowingly collecting entirely domestic conversations and multi-communication transactions. And the government's argument was, well, we know we're collecting tens of thousands of entirely domestic conversations, but we don't know at the moment we collect them, only after we read them and look at the content. So we should be allowed to collect all this information. Well, that just goes against the spirit, the statute, like the statutory language itself. In 2017, in the FISA Amendments Reauthorization Act, Congress mandated a technical procedure, this is the direct language, whereby a record is kept of each US person query term. And the FBI came into the FISC and said, well, we don't actually have to keep a record of every US person query term. We're just going to keep all of them and not specify which hit US persons. And the amici disagreed with the government, the court disagreed. So they appealed it to the FISCer. And the FISCer agreed with the court below, agreed with the amici. And the FBI was saying, we couldn't possibly do this. And it turns out they can possibly do it, right? So they came back and they had to figure out a way to actually do this. That's different as a matter of legal fidelity to statutory interpretations that go directly against the will of Congress, or that act in direct violation of the statute. So for instance, in 2011, it turned out that the NSA had been acquiring 702 data from before the court actually authorized section 702, right? Or applications have to be based on factual information and affidavit. Well, it turns out Horowitz 1, 2, and 3, the saga continues. It's not being based on factual data or any files to support that information. Now, that kind of fidelity to the law is separate from fidelity to judicial direction. And once again, we're seeing with the government, there a lack of fidelity when the court tells them to do something, they don't necessarily do it. So I'll just give you again a few examples. They in March of 2009, the court discovered that the government had repeatedly been telling them that the NSA had not been running queries of metadata using terms that didn't meet kind of the required principle of reasonable articulable suspicion. But it had been so systematically violated, the court's dictate, that it could be said that this never functioned. It was just ignored. In October of 2016, the government informed the court it had been still for 5 years ignoring Judge Bates's direction in 2011. And there were several more noncompliance issues. Similarly, the direction to report noncompliance, the government turned out was picking and choosing which noncompliance it would report to the court. And when the court found out, it had to say, no, when we say we want you to report noncompliance, we mean all noncompliance has to be reported. Failure to purge records. It turned out that the overcollection of records, the court ordered them to be placed on the master purge list in 2011. By 2015, they still hadn't been purged, right? So fidelity to judicial direction matters. And the last category is fidelity to process. So when these processes are adopted, they need to be followed within the executive branch. So the querying procedures, in 2016, for instance, the government informed the court they hadn't been following their own querying procedures. In Horowitz 1, we saw all of these procedures. The Woods procedures weren't being followed. The affidavit procedures weren't being followed. Horowitz 2, when they looked at 29 different FISA applications on US persons, they found 209 errors, between 5 and 60 in every application, some of which were material to the investigation or material to establishing probable cause. Most recently, this month, we have Horowitz 3, which reviewed more than 7,000 FISA applications from 2015 to 2020 and found persistent problems. 183 cases, there were either no Woods files whatsoever, or they were partially missing. So, the fidelity to the law, fidelity to judicial direction, and fidelity to process, it's something different from transparency, but it's absolutely essential if the government is going to try to build trust and have the country give the government the power and the ability to collect information.
Chris, there's a lot there. I want to give you a chance to respond since your feet are probably burning here. And I also want to bring in another question from an attendee unnamed who asked something that's on this point. I'll just read it verbatim here. To Chris's claim regarding law not keeping up, to what extent does one traditional legislative approach to solving the pacing problem, in quotes, by using standards instead of rules fall apart in the national security context, given the secrecy at the FISC? And this seems like the meat of the question. Have transparency, amicus participation adequately addressed this problem? So to you.
So that's quite a thing, quite a litany to have to respond to, and I will obviously not respond to the specific instances that Laura has identified.
Of course, yeah.
I think in general, though, the way I would think about what you've just run through is fidelity to law, fidelity to court direction, fidelity to process. I mean, and I recognize that this is just I told you so, but I think, inside the executive branch, those things matter a lot. And we try a lot to, we feel we take an oath to follow the Constitution and follow the laws of the United States. We follow court orders and we try to follow our processes. Now, this is an enormous enterprise that is trying to do the right thing, and we make mistakes. And the FISC, for a portion of that collection, is in place to sort of be our auditor, the entity that authorizes us or corrects the mistakes we're making. I mean, I thought it was telling, and just to pick out one of the examples, one of your examples of not having fidelity to law is making arguments to a court where an amicus also made arguments to a court and we lost the case. And obviously, in the first instance, we would have loved to have taken the position that the court adopted, but the fact that the government is willing to subject its arguments to a court, have an amicus come in and make a counter argument, appeal it in, and then when it loses, take the court's order. That, I think, is in some ways, that's not in some ways, that is the system working, and that's the system we've set up. I mean, I don't think the government's going to get it right every single time. I think that sometimes we're going to take legal positions the FISC will disagree with. It happens occasionally. I think sometimes the FISC is going to make judicial orders that we have to interpret, and our interpretations might be inaccurate. Sometimes we might just make mistakes. I mean, I'm not justifying that. It shouldn't happen. We should try to make sure it doesn't happen. But any large organization the size of the intelligence community, that's going to happen. And I think the only thing we can do is try to do our best, which I think leads to the second question you asked, Shane, about how do we solve this pacing problem? In some ways, it's the same problem that Laura is raising, which is the law is indeterminate and facts have to be applied to law, and it's difficult, and the government tries its best to do it, and the FISC is one way we do a check on that. I mean, the rules standard debate, one way to do it is like, and this is, I think Laura mentioned this earlier, you can write the laws broad enough that there's no way the government can get them wrong. That doesn't seem, I mean, obviously, probably the government lawyer in me would say there's something that's attractive about that, but I don't think that's necessarily the right answer. I think we try the best we can, and that's, Congress writes laws based on the technology that's prevalent at the time. Over time, the FISC interprets them. Information doesn't become public in the same way it does in other areas of regulation, but it becomes public through the declassification of opinions and proceedings where the amicus participates, and we update them over time as we can. And I think it's interesting to contrast this area, which is much more secret in some ways, with other areas of governmental activity. I mean, a lot of the agencies and departments and agencies in our government are operating under statutes that are far, far older and have been amended much, much less than the prevailing statutes that the intelligence community operates under. So this is an area where I think there has been a lot of engagement, both by the public and by mediating bodies of public life like Congress and the FISC to right size what we're doing. Doesn't mean we're exactly in the right place, but I think it is in some ways. I think it's important to recognize that as well, and not that this is some untapped space where there's really no public discussion about it. I think it's in some ways to the contrary.
Laura, I know you have a brief interjection. I'll let you make that. Please be very brief, because there's another really good question I want to get to that pivots us off this a bit. Yeah.
So I appreciate what you're saying, Chris. I think there's a higher fiduciary duty on the government to the kinds of arguments it secretly makes in a TSSCI environment behind closed doors to a court. And I think that means that there just has to be a higher standard of statutory interpretation and behavior because of the environment. You don't have full adversarial counsel. And the idea that you would rely on the court to police you or to ensure your compliance. Like that puts the court in a really unusual position, and one that it hasn't historically had, and comes with it a whole host of other issues that present. So I appreciate the position that you're taking on this, but I also would suggest a higher fiduciary duty on the government, particularly in a national security environment.
Just 30 seconds in response to that. I don't think I was ever suggesting that we didn't have a higher duty in this environment. I also think that I think, that wherever you draw the line in terms of what your duty is, there's going to be questions that arise. And I think the best thing you can do then is present them to the court and see what they say. And I think that's the point I was making. On the compliance side, I don't think the government thinks, I certainly don't think, that our job is to try to get away with stuff and have the FISC catch us. I think most of the compliance incidents that the FISC is aware of, the government actually tells the FISC about. So I think that it's one of the bodies that checks what we're doing and oversees what we're doing. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying the government's behavior is perfect, but in some ways, I think that that's those are the points I wanted to make in response.
All right, well, we have an audience question here from Carrie Parker. I want to pitch this over to Sharon. And I like this because this is actually kind of looking ahead at some issues that we haven't gotten to yet, but I think that are really ripe right now and deserving of attention. Carrie asks, what can we do to stop the end run around the Fourth Amendment and similar rights that comes from law enforcement and intelligence agencies buying surveillance data from the private sector, specifically data brokers? In my beat in the intelligence community, this is a hot topic, and I would love for Sharon to give some response. And maybe if we do it briefly, maybe everyone can weigh in. But Sharon, to Carrie's question, I mean, what do you think about this, and what can we do if there is, in fact, if you agree there's an end run around the Fourth Amendment here, as Carrie's phrasing it?
Thanks. I love that question, and I promise this was not a plant. CDT actually has a report that will be coming out before the end of the year looking at exactly this question. But let me speak to it a little bit and a little preview. So we are very much concerned about that, and I myself have used that end run phrase repeatedly. We have, both in the statutory context, we have the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is outdated in many respects, but it does have a series of requirements for electronic communication service providers and on what information they can turn over under what circumstances, and what they can voluntarily turn over, and when they can provide information to the government. And unfortunately, there's kind of a loophole in the law. So basically, the law sets certain standards, and I won't go into it in that much detail because I see we're getting close to the end of our time. But the government, in order to obtain information like location information and the content of communications, has to meet certain standards, whether it's probable cause warrant standard based on court interpretations, or what's called a D order, which is still a court order meeting certain standards in order to obtain this information. But the providers can voluntarily provide information, certain kinds of information, to others. And so we have a loophole in the law where if that information is provided not to the government, but it ultimately can, through a chain, end up in the hands of data brokers and then be purchased by the government. The other thread I want to mention here, in addition to ECPA, is the Carpenter decision coming from the Supreme Court. So in 2018, the Supreme Court considered a case involving collection of cell site location information from phones for a period of 7 days or more, and found that even though providers collecting that location information have this information, it's not directly from the individual, there really is an expectation of privacy in the individual whose information is involved, that it is tracking somebody for that period of time using this location information can reveal so much information about where they have gone, the privacies of life, their connections, where they go, who they associate with, and that the government needed to obtain a warrant in order to collect that information from the provider. And in that Carpenter opinion, the court was careful to say, we are just considering the situation. We are not looking to the national security context. We are not considering other contexts. But it didn't say it doesn't apply there. And if you read the language of Carpenter and think through the analysis of Carpenter and what it means and what it recognized about sensitive information that reflects the privacy of life, you would come to the conclusion, I submit, that it covers a whole lot more information and a lot more contexts. So this is also a situation in which we feel that both the constitutional analysis under Carpenter, as well as the statutory analysis, while it's not written down in law and government agencies can legitimately say there's no specific prohibition on this practice, when the government actually buys up this information from data brokers, it does indeed amount to an end run. And we need to have either legislation from Congress or self-imposed policy restrictions, and others will be making a number of recommendations in our report to address this situation.
Great. So we are past our cutoff time. I'm mindful of the fact that people may need to go. If you do need to drop out, this is all being recorded. You can catch it later. Go back, watch at your leisure. We're going to just push on a little bit longer since we got started a bit late, and we have some really great questions. There are two that are related here that I want to pose from unnamed attendees regarding the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Laura, I'm going to go to you first with this question. I'm going to put them together, actually. How do you rate the PCLOB's performance to date, and what do you see for it in the future? And then getting a little more specific to that, another participant asks, should the PCLOB be restructured organizationally, part-time status, hiring ability, et cetera? If so, how? And should the mandate and areas of focus of the PCLOB be expanded? So Laura, thoughts on that?
So the PCLOB played a really instrumental role right after Snowden, coming out first with a Section 215 report. Then they went after 702. And in fact, a number of courts still cite to the PCLOB 702 report on the ordinary geographic side of Article 3, not just the Fisker, because that's actually one of the places that they can get authoritative information about how 702 works. And then they turned to 12333. And I'm also cognizant while I'm speaking that Sharon is really the expert on this panel on PCLOB. So I think I'll leave to her to really kind of delve into what needs to change about PCLOB. I will say that as a consumer of PCLOB information, I have found it very helpful and very helpful for the public discussion as well. I think it's been very valuable. I do want to say a quick word about the Fourth Amendment carve out that Sharon mentioned as well. And here there are really three areas where I think what's happening is the government is essentially creating a constitutional carve out where the constitutional rights go to die. And if these three things were to change, I think we would be able to actually challenge constitutionally some of what is happening in the surveillance realm a lot more effectively. And the first, Chris, I hope you have control over this, because the derived from, what actually counts as derived from FISA, that is still classified. And if that information were made public, then criminal defendants who are presented with FISA related information, they would be more aware of what derived from means, and they could challenge more effectively, potentially, surveillance derived from FISA. The second is the state secrets doctrine. And, it's hard to have this panel within days, right? Tomorrow, Zubedea will be argued on state secrets privilege. There's another case coming up, Fazaga, which is a Fourth Amendment challenge or case that's being brought that was brought originally in the Ninth Circuit, but is going to the Supreme Court on November 8th. And then Wikimedia was just settled in the Fifth Circuit. And Wikimedia, that case is really disturbing because it basically says, post Snowden and transparency, we now know that Wikimedia is under surveillance. We know that. They can establish standing. The problem is that if they try to bring a Fourth Amendment claim, the government is trying to dismiss the entire suit using state secrets privilege. And that is really kind of a gross overturning of the way state secrets worked up until the Jeppesen case, which alleged torture and went after a private contractor actually for their role in torture post 9/11. Since then, the government has been using state secrets privilege, not just as an evidentiary rule, but actually to try to get entire suits dismissed and kind of applying the Taunton rule where the subject matter was classified, but in this case, trying to dismiss the whole suit, even at a pleading stage. And that's really concerning because that prevents challenge in the courts. The final kind of the triumvirate here that I would say, if we really want to be able to challenge more effectively what's happening, would be the government's assertion that it can classify judicial opinions. This comes from Department of Navy versus Egan, which is a case that actually dealt with which agency within the executive branch should be able to issue security clearances. It had nothing to do with interbranch issues. And initially that was cited correctly in government submissions to all of the courts, to the Fisker, as well as to ordinary courts. It's increasingly being used to claim that the executive branch can stop judicial opinions from being published. So these three claims, that they don't need to show derived from, which hits criminal defendants, that they can apply state secrets privilege. And in fact, in many of these cases, they say even the court cannot look at the information. And then the claim that they can classify judicial opinions, relying on a case that actually said nothing of that sort. These three barriers basically make it very difficult to constitutionally challenge, which really amount to an end run around the Fourth Amendment, at least as a doctrinal matter, as cases work their way through the courts.
In the interest of time, I'm going to go to Sharon, then Chris for any comments on that and kind of last words, but let's be mindful that we're pretty much at the outer end of our time here. So we'll kind of conclude with the two of you.
Thanks. On last words, I would just say I had a chance to talk about a number of reforms that I think are critically important in restoring or imposing guardrails where none exist. The one piece I didn't get to mention, we had a little bit of mention earlier about the Court of Justice in the European Union striking down the Privacy Shield, and it citing in particular insufficient safeguards under US law for surveillance. So I think that's another opportunity for our government to take a long, hard look at our surveillance laws and adopt reforms. There's a lot that the government can do without Congress. Everyone, I'm sure, is aware it's much harder to get reforms through Congress. There's a lot the government can do on its own. Although in that regard, also there is the issue of redress, which may require Congress at the end. But we need to move forward with a comprehensive look at our surveillance laws and in a meaningful way.
And Chris, last word to you.
Well, thank you. I guess two quick things. One is thanks to you, Shane, for doing a great job moderating, and to Laura and Sharon for being great co-panelists. And I guess I'd end kind of going back to Sharon's discussion of commercially available information, which I think kind of encapsulates in my mind a lot of what we've been discussing in this call in two ways. One is it's just a really difficult issue for the reasons that Sharon said. The wide availability, the public availability, and the ability to purchase these large data sets that can really be insightful about individuals is obviously raises enormous privacy and civil liberties issues. At the same time, these things are available for public purchase. Other nations beside the United States can purchase them. That's something that the intelligence community also has to take into account. So how do you draw the lines in a world like that is very difficult. Which I think that, this came up during my confirmation process, came up during the DNI's confirmation process. And to Sharon's point, I think we're actively thinking about developing a framework for how to do that. And that's, I think, where debates like this and the work that CDT does comes into play. I think this is as the back and forth between the panelists show, this has been a nonstop discussion for definitely the last 20 years and for many years before that. So we really welcome folks talking to us about this and trying to arrive at the right answers, because they're not always obvious. So thank you very much to all of you.
And thank you, Laura and Sharon and Chris, and to CDT for hosting us and bringing us together and letting me moderate this. As everyone watching from home or wherever you are can appreciate, this is an extraordinarily dense, very complicated, but important topic. And I think that you see in our three panelists here, I think we can all take some reassurance from the fact that people are very deeply dedicated to trying to get this right, to being thoughtful about it, to studying it. So I'm really grateful to the three of you for taking some time out of your day to come talk about this with people and to do it in a respectful and engaging and constructive way. I think that's something that everybody should be happy about, and I think is a net positive. So thanks for taking your time. Thanks to all of you from home for watching it, and we'll see you again.